It's an exciting day, and I've got an amazing subject to talk to you about today. It's environmental hazards in commercial real estate. How do you deal with them? Do you even know they exist? What's going on with the whole environmental thing? And the thing that I've found is most people, whether they're investors, business owners, real estate agents, or business brokers, bankers. There's so many people involved in the commercial real estate process, and they don't really understand how the environmental science fits into this whole equation, what's important, what's not important. And so today we are talking to Alexandra Niculescu. Did I say that right?
Yep, good
Close?
job. Yep,
Oh,
very good.
wow.
It was
It's
good,
probably
good
the
job.
only time on this whole video that I'm going to say it right. So we're going to take the win and roll from there. She goes by Rux. You're the only person I know named Rux. So that's good because you're unique in my Rolodex. When I type in to find you in my contacts, RUX, there you are. I met Rux, about 3 months ago. She came to a luncheon and presented on environmental issues in commercial real estate to a bunch of business brokers. I really appreciate you being here. And one of the things I really appreciate you did about Rux is she can explain things in simple English, because there's so many people out there that is like, oh, you have to have a PhD to understand what I'm saying. Not Rux. She can actually talk to a fifth grader. She probably talks to her dogs. And if she's like Dr. Doolittle, they answer her, right?
Sometimes, yes.
Sometimes, yes. Okay. All right. You're a business owner. You own an environmental services company. Do you call it environmental services, or what do you call yourself? Environmental engineering?
Yeah, so environmental consulting is probably, first of all, thank you for having me on. But environmental consulting is probably a good way to explain it because it catches so many things. We do the due diligence side, commercial real estate, we do the actual cleanup. So that's probably a good way of explaining it, is
All right.
consulting.
Cool. And one of the things that interests me about Rux, and I think will interest you too, is she is a multi-state person, meaning that her consulting company is based in New Jersey. She lives and works out of an office in the Sacramento area, and she's got several states that she works in. So she's able to present this not just from a California perspective or a New Jersey perspective, but she has a better scope handle on how environmental consulting differs across the United States. And since our audience is people who are across the United States and even globally, I really like that extra perspective. How long have you been in environmental services consulting, and how'd you get started?
So, yeah, we're based in New Jersey. We actually cover 13 states. So that's primarily on the East Coast and then obviously California. We purchased the company in 2006. So I've been doing this since probably a little bit before that in 2000. I started doing it part-time. My folks own the business. We just kind of grew from a tiny little, in the basement kind of operation. Now we have probably over a dozen employees, like I said, in 13 different states, which sounds like a lot for a tiny small business, but it's interesting to see how the regulatory framework changes from state to state. You've got California and New Jersey that are highly regulated, and then you'll pop over into Pennsylvania and there's not as much. It's an opt-in state, so it's really up to the property owner. If you find a problem, but it's not impacting the waters of Pennsylvania, no one really is going to come after you for doing that cleanup. And that's very different from California, New Jersey, even New York and some other states.
One of the things that really interested me when you talked at the luncheon was you said that in California, a lot of people, they walk into a retail center and they're like, oh, look, this looks great. But then they don't realize that there used to be a dry cleaner there. And I was shocked when you said that even a thimbleful of solvent from a dry cleaner could go through the porous concrete and contaminate the soil and cause an environmental issue in California, whereas in most parts of the world, people wouldn't even realize it. Tell me a little bit about that.
Sure. So solvents, issue with solvents is they don't really sit in soil. They seek out groundwater, they travel very quickly, and once it hits groundwater, it starts to spread. And the problem with solvents is the vapors that come up into the building. So anytime you have solvent contamination, and the most common one that people hear about is tetrachloroethylene. So you've got the TCE and the PCE from
Whoa,
those
whoa, whoa,
dry
whoa,
cleaner.
stop just a second.
Too much?
No, I mean, it's just like, so instead of saying TCE, Tetra, whatever the heck it was, um, what's like a common product name that a consumer would know, or is there one,
There
you
isn't
know?
one. That's exactly what it's PCE and TCE
So that's
is
how
the
the
term.
dry cleaners buy the stuff in a 5 gallon bucket
Yeah,
of
it's they're
TCE or whatever.
solvents. It'll say solvent really big on the side. So I guess the only common way to refer to it would be solvent.
Okay,
And
just
that's a
the
big,
generic term.
yeah, that is a big umbrella for a lot of different types of cleaning products. And I wrote an article on it several years ago that you can go back to the late 1800s and how they started with, white gasoline, and then they went to Stoddard and then different kinds of solvents, and how it's progressed. And now they claim they have green dry cleaning, which is really just some sort of derivative of gasoline product. So it's not really, when they say it's all natural, it's because it's coming out of the ground, but we're still talking about
Hey,
something that
it's
could be
dinosaurs.
hazardous. Sure,
We're
true.
recycling dinosaurs to clean your clothes.
Yes. But yes, a very small amount can cause a really big problem. Is because it's so cancerous. It's hard to quantify, just how bad it can be, and it's the breakdown of it that makes it worse. Because and to use acronyms again, so PCE will break down into TCE, and that's actually worse over a shorter period of time. So you've got to look at which one do I have and how bad is it for the on the short term and on the long term. And it's one of those things that you're not going to know simply.
Okay,
There's a lot that goes into it, which is
all
why I
right.
still have a job.
Got it. Okay, so you put together a slide presentation. I'm just going to go ahead and share that so that we have some
Sure.
structure to our conversation today. And I renamed this to Demystifying Environmental Due Diligence. When you're talking about scope, what are you talking about?
We have to follow a standard. It's the ASTM standard, depending on which type of service we're providing. Generally, when we get engaged for any sort of environmental work, it's because there's a real estate transaction. So we always like to say, top things that keep borrowers or lenders up at night, would generally a crying baby or your dog maybe throwing up or wanting something. But what I've found so many times people will call me at 6 in the morning, or I get a random midnight email and they're like, where's my environmental, how's my environmental doing? And it really stresses people out because they don't understand it, they don't know why the process takes so long, what's involved. They just want to know, is my site clean? When can I close on my loan? When can I buy my property? Or is something going to make me spend tens of thousands of dollars and then I can't do what I want to do with the site?
Got it. Okay. All right. So now there's this whole process that you go through as an environmental consultant when you go through and follow the standards that are out there. And we'll talk about standards in just a minute. But here on this slide, you've got about finding an appropriate scope. What are we talking about there?
Sure. So, depending on the type of property and where you are in your due diligence process, you maybe don't even know that you need something. And the different scopes would be, do you need a phase one? Are you ready to move forward with a lender? Do you maybe want to buy a residential property and you just want to know, is there anything I should be concerned about, which would be more of a transaction screen? Is there anything that's not included in the regular standards that you want more information on, like asbestos or lead-based paint, rate on any of those things? So those would be the different, there's a bunch of different scopes and then scope considerations. And then you need to know how to read the report and what's actually a problem and what's not a problem, and what can you do to educate yourself on how to navigate through this whole environmental minefield.
Okay. So I've found in my own personal practice as a commercial real estate broker that most of the transactions I'm involved in, and they don't, the lender doesn't care too much. I mean, they have the seller of the property fill out a questionnaire. It's a 1 page or 2 page questionnaire. And as long as there's no red flags on that, they're just like, okay, fine. We've completed your environmental due diligence for our loan process. So
That's
is there something else?
terrifying.
Is there something else going on in the background with these lenders that they're actually writing other reports and stuff to determine whether or not the owner disclosed properly?
I'm going to say maybe because it depends on the lender. Every lender has their own risk policy. So there may be some lenders that all they require is that environmental questionnaire. Now, a lot of lenders will take that environmental questionnaire and then they give it to their internal risk team, and they may already be ordering a whole, whatever their due diligence process requires, be it a transaction screen or risk assessment. They may be doing an internal review. They may be doing the full phase one. But either way, they will request that questionnaire, and then that goes into whatever scope they implement. And then they'll come back and say everything is fine or everything is not fine. It's very rare that just that questionnaire is the linchpin to the whole thing.
Since I was yeah, one class away from having a chemistry major in college, I like your little comic that you put in here. You've got different things listed here. Tell us a little bit about what the importance of this table for someone who is an investor or a real estate agent or a business broker.
Sure. So there's a lot of different environmental things that you can do or request for a property. And I can't tell you the number of times that I get a phone call and someone says, I need an environmental. And then we have to start excavating and figure out, okay, what exactly do you mean? Because there are standards that we have to follow, and that would be, for example, the transaction screen, the phase one, the phase two, and then there's different layers on that. So SBA has their own SOP, is a standard operating procedure where they request just a risk assessment. So that doesn't involve going to the
So
site. That
RSA is a risk assessment. Is that what that
it's
stands
a
for?
it's a record search and risk assessment. Basically just we look at records, and then we give a risk rating for low, elevated, or high risk. And then generally, if it's high risk, we would recommend either a transaction screen or a phase one from that point on.
All right. So
But
let's back up just a second.
sure,
The first column is ERE. What does that
that's an
stand for?
that is an environmental risk evaluation. And I think we go into a little bit more detail on all of these in a later slide, but the environmental
Okay.
risk evaluation is something that we actually developed as a screening tool. Sometimes we find that if a bank is doing a renewal, or if they want to know, do I need to be concerned about this property going into it, it's really helpful to have that information. There have been so many times where we get through the whole transaction screen or through the whole phase one, and we find out, hey, more data would be helpful. Do you have a prior report? Is there somewhere else that we can get documents? The ERE helps us kind of get that heads up in the beginning of the process so that the borrower, the bank, everybody can be prepped, because it's really not helpful to try and hide things. That causes so many problems, and more often than not results in us making recommendations to do more work. So it's nice to
But
get the heads up.
that's a really, really important point that you're making. I think we should dive into just a little bit.
Sure.
People want to hide things because they don't understand the implications of what they're doing. I love watching crime shows, right?
Yes.
Okay. And not saying that this is an environmental crime, but it's like when the attorney is interviewing their client, they're saying, look, I don't, it's not my job to figure out if you're guilty or not, but you've got to tell me what's going to be uncovered by the prosecutor, or say a defense attorney, when they do this, because if I know what they're going to uncover, then I can prepare for that and how to defend you for that. So is that kind of the same way with doing an environmental consult on a piece of property? It's like, go ahead and just tell us where your warts and hemorrhoids are so that we can deal with them, right?
It is. Well, and I don't know why folks think that keeping data from us will help them in some way. I presume they think it's oh, if I don't tell them, they won't find out. And maybe they just don't know the breadth of information that we have to accumulate and what we go through. But a great example is we just did a site, I think maybe last year, and it was right here in Sacramento, and it wasn't anything crazy going on at the property, but historically there had been problems. And we asked we asked the owner if he had any reports, and he said no, 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 no. And there was a problem from a site next door, and it was a county-owned site, and it looked like it was causing massive contamination on the property. There was wells on either side, monitoring wells on either side, and in theory, it looked like there was contamination under his property. So we had to write that up as a problem. And the loan actually didn't go through because of what was going on at the site. He didn't want to do the follow up with any of the investigation. And we found out maybe just a month or two ago that he actually had a letter from the county saying, hey, everything is fine on your site. We're responsible for the cleanup. Hold on to this letter just in case. And he decided he didn't want to share that information. And it would have cleared up everything, and his loan would have probably gone through without a problem. But he decided not to share. I can't explain why. That
And something like that, that just seems kind of inane to me. That if you have a letter saying you're in the clear, dude, share this letter with people in the future, you would share that letter. And I would expect
Yes,
things, that people would be hiding bad stuff, you know.
you'd think, I expected that there was something that said it's a problem, and maybe it's just that he didn't understand because it was an official document on official county letterhead, and there was a lot in it. And when I read it, there was one sentence and buried in a paragraph that said, we take responsibility for anything that happens, you're fine. And it's possible he just didn't understand that, and he's like, this is bad, I need to not disclose it. But that's just an example of, you know what you know and I know what I know, and it's in your best interest to give me the information so I can help you, because I'm not trying to go out there and find problems for you. It's my job to figure out how do we get over this hurdle so you can keep on doing what you do.
Got it. Okay, so you got the records search and records analysis. And so the SBA requires that, it looks like. And then
So this is
transaction screen. Or
yeah,
do you
so
have something else to say about the RSRA?
so the RSRA is just a smaller scope that the SBA specifically accepts, and the purpose of this was to show that even even looking at this, it's a little bit confusing when you say, okay, well, it looks like a transaction screen and a phase one require the same stuff, but then when you get into the nitty-gritties of it, the records that are involved with a transaction screen, what we have to look at is different than a phase one. The output, I guess, is a little bit different because a phase one will have more information than a transaction screen. A phase two will have different sampling requirements than any other scope. And it's kind of like you start on the left side with your EREs, and that's the bare minimum that you can look at. And then you go all the way through the spectrum and it gets more and more involved.
Okay, cool. I think a lot of people wonder what exactly is a phase one?
The phase one, it really depends on what stage of the process you're in. So if you're getting a loan and you want to know, am I liable or potentially liable for some sort of cleanup? It is something that I always recommend to every owner, buyer, and it's something that I recommend that they get specifically when the bank orders it. It's great for the lender. We do them all the time for lenders, but they won't necessarily hand those over to the borrower. They still pay for it, but they literally have to call us up. The borrower has to call us and ask if they can get a copy, and then we have to ask the lender. And that's just
Oh,
it's a big
so
liability
this is a really
mess.
interesting question.
Sure.
So if you're going to do environmental, you want to coordinate with and collaborate with your lender and say, hey, I want to make sure that I get a copy of this report afterwards. Should they ask for something in writing saying that they're going to be able to get a copy? Or should they say, can I order the report so I know I'm going to get a copy and then share it with you based on a list of of
They have
approved vendors,
Yeah, they
or
have to ask that
how do you
question.
do this?
Definitely ask the question. There are a lot of lenders that have their own vendor list and they won't accept unsolicited reports. You need to make sure you have a reliance letter. If you do get what's called a third party report that's not on the bank's vendor list, some banks will just take it. They expect you to bring your own phase one. That is definitely a conversation to have. And it's rare that I've seen a lender not release a copy of the report, but there is additional paperwork, and that can hold up the process if you want a copy for your own purposes and you weren't ready for the forms and how long it's going to take.
So when should someone who wants to sell a piece of property start thinking about the environmental consulting part of that equation? And I think we also need to make clear that this is really important for people who are leasing property also, because if you go into a place as a landlord and you're like, okay, I want to lease this out, you want to set kind of like a baseline of what environmental issues existed prior to leasing so that your leasing contract can address that the tenant will be responsible for anything that happens while they're controlling the property, right?
Yes, I will caveat that by saying that it depends what state you're in, especially if it's a facility in New Jersey. They have the Industrial Site Recovery Act, and the owner of the property is responsible for whatever the tenant does, regardless of whether or not they have some sort of agreement that says you, tenant, are responsible for your own cleanup. New Jersey doesn't care. They're going to go after whoever they can. So
I
I would
think in most states, the attorneys are going to go after whoever they can and whoever has the deepest pockets. But it's still important, I think,
it is.
to mitigate your risk by setting a baseline so that you can determine what contamination, if any, existed at a particular point in time, so you can help determine who was at fault if there is contamination in the future.
Yes, and that's the whole. So to answer your initial question, I would say not earlier than 6 months. The phase one has a 1 year shelf life. You can do an update within 6 months, and it doesn't involve as much of all of the same stuff as if you did it from the beginning. But if you do it too soon, then you potentially have to do it all over again just to keep it current. So to answer the second part of the question, anytime you want to qualify for innocent landowner, and you have to do all appropriate inquiry. That's what that AAI piece at the bottom is. It's a lot of very dry language. If you ever want to read the ASTM, it's all defined in there. But basically, the phase one has language in it that says if you do all appropriate inquiry, then you've done your due diligence and say you find contamination, you know where it came from, who the responsible party is, you know it's not you. So if contamination shows up later, no one can point the finger and say, well, maybe this was your fault.
It's still very helpful, even in some place like New Jersey, where they're still going to nail the property owner, to be able to identify what contamination existed, if any, so that especially if contamination migrates from another property site, they've got something to go back and have a benchmark for, right?
Yes, and with New Jersey specifically, they have a whole separate process if you're going to go through a state program, and this is for industrial facilities specifically. And that goes back to the Industrial Site Recovery Act. If your property falls into an ISRA subject NAICS code, then you have to go through that ISRA program with the state, and then you no longer can do just a phase one. It has to be a preliminary assessment. Generally, it's coupled with a site investigation, and then then we could do a whole talk probably just about this. It's very involved, and it's not simple.
I'm going to
So
let a New
it,
Jersey licensed person do that with you.
yeah, that's a whole, and that's a good point because they do have licensed site remediation professionals, which is where you would go into that whole state program. So that's
Yeah.
a whole separate ball game. But you can still do the phase one, and we do them all the time as part of real estate transactions. You don't want to go into that whole preliminary assessment program because you no longer have the reasonable reasonably ascertainable timeframes that are in the phase one. And the phase one standard allows you to say, okay, we've looked hard enough. We can't get this information within the confines of what the expectations are. So we're going to stop right now and say, okay, this is what we have. These are our findings. If you're going through the state program, that's not an option. You have to keep digging until you're done digging. And that doesn't usually work with real estate loans.
Right. I want to emphasize too that an environmental report can be very important for the tenant, someone who's leasing property also, because we've really addressed it from the owner side. And so go ahead and talk a little bit about, as a tenant, why would you want to order one of these or do any environmental risk assessment?
With that, it's really, are your workers, are you at risk? Is there anything that you are liable for? Say you do something that involves any sort of hazardous materials or hazardous chemicals. You want to know, am I liable for something when I leave? Is someone going to come knocking on my door and say, "Hey, we found, X contamination and we think it's your fault." And if you don't have something that says, "Well, when I moved in, everything was fine," then there's really no way for you to say it's not me. You can try and say, "Well, here's my list of chemicals. Does it match the list of things that is in the groundwater, is in the soil gases, in the soil?" But that becomes a much more challenging argument than if you have something up front that says, "I'm fine for the following reasons." And it doesn't need to be anything that's super involved. You could do like those risk assessments. You could do a transaction screen. It's also probably a good idea to ask the owner if they have any sort of environmental report up front, just so you know, okay, this was my baseline where I can start, and just go from there. But I think it's always a good idea to have something that gives you an idea of, is there a problem? Am I liable? Are the people in the building safe? You could have a daycare center there, and if it was a dry cleaner previously, is it safe for kids? I don't know. That's something that would have to be looked at.
All right, so we've talked here about risk tolerance and loan types. So what do you mean by loan type?
So loan types, depending on the lender, they will have different the risk tolerances that speculate. I have to have a phase one, a transaction screen, a risk assessment. And a lot of times that's based on the loan type or loan amount. So if you're doing, for example, a single family home construction loan, you don't need to go full blown phase one. You can maybe just do a risk assessment, or you could do a transaction screen just to get an idea of, is there a gas station down the street that caused the problem, or a dry cleaner or something else. So you don't need to do as much. And if you have a giant industrial park, you probably do want to do a phase one. A transaction screen is not going to cut it. And the loan type will sometimes stipulate what you need to do. For example, a renewal, you could just do maybe a risk assessment depending on how big the loan is.
Yeah, so for example, I just closed a piece of agricultural property and there was nothing at all from the lender asking for anything from the property owner. Whereas, and on a gas station, you have gas stations down below. It's like a phase one is probably going to be required almost for many gas stations, right?
Yeah, so I've seen them. I've seen them just ask for transaction screens. I haven't had one for a very long time, thankfully. But this list is generally a little snapshot of when you would want a phase one if you have an industrial property, if it's industrial and commercial, if it's a gas station, if it's a strip mall. I know a lot of times people say, like, oh, it's just, four tiny buildings. It's a nail salon, a donut shop, and, two retail. And my question is always, what was in that strip mall before, though? So anytime I see a strip mall, I always recommend that we do a phase one just so we know that there was nothing that was concerning. Let's see, the location is also a really big one. I know you said you just closed that agricultural site, then they
Hmm.
requested nothing. That's hard to say. I mean, what type of agriculture? Did they have pesticides? That's automatically a red flag, but most people don't look at it right now. If it's going to still be agricultural, if they're going to redevelop it at some point, maybe, but it's
Yeah, it was
still
an almond orchard with a
okay.
20-year lease because the trees are young.
we've done so many agricultural sites where it's not necessarily the orchard that's a problem because we have to take into consideration, is there going to be a change in use? Again, do they use pesticides? Is it, organic? Do they have any sort of maintenance that they do on site? We've seen agricultural sites where they have a little shed or a whole barn and they store vehicles, they have drums in there, they've got tanks for their wells that they use for irrigation. Those tanks are leaking, the wells are leaking. I've seen so many things at agricultural sites, and people don't really think, they're like, oh, it's just, almonds, or it's some cows, or it's whatever. And they don't take into consideration that, maybe there's something over here. And a great example of that was we did a site. It was a big ranch. It was huge. Most adorable cows you've ever seen. But the gentleman had a house, and then he had a fuel tank and generally you're supposed to have a containment area around your tank in case it has some sort of catastrophic failure. It can contain whatever the release is. And as
Hmm.
we're walking around, I'm looking at his containment, and he's got two holes inside the containment. And I asked him, I said, can you talk to me about what these holes are for? And he says, well, we wanted to make sure that if it rains, the water can drain out. And I said, okay. I
I can
I
see where this is going.
I get that, and I asked him, and I said, okay, I see you've got a drainage system just down this little hill. Can you tell me where that goes? And he says, well, that goes over to my other yard in the front, and I used to keep goats there, but they kept dying, and I don't know why, so we don't have goats anymore. I thought he was joking, but this man seriously could not connect the dots for
Oh,
why his goats were dying, which was very
that's
sad for the goats. But so that's just an example of you'll find things at agricultural sites that maybe you didn't think were going to be a problem, but they are, and
yep.
nobody's really looking because the farm.
Sure. Okay. Strip malls. I mean,
Sure.
there's kind of the obvious culprit. The dry cleaner historically, I think, has been the number one culprit in strip malls. But are there some other tenants or a tenant mix that is like it kind of like hidden under the radar, but they can cause big problems?
Print shops would potentially be another one.
What'd you
I,
say?
I've print shops, like printing
Oh, printing.
operations.
Got it.
Yeah.
Got it.
So I've seen those sometimes, more historically than now. I think now we have, at least in smaller spaces, you're not going to find the same type of solvents, but screen printing would have also used some sort of solvent. And anytime you have a solvent or some sort of chemical, that's an operation of concern. I'm trying to think if there's other things that you would find in a strip mall that might be an issue. And I'm drawing a little bit of a blank on it. So I think generally dry cleaners are the big ones, but I have found some printing operations that raise red flags in strip malls, but not as much as the dry cleaners.
And I think in the lunch at the luncheon, you mentioned that tailors sometimes will have issues because even though they're not someone you would expect, they're still using solvents on clothes to like remove spots and stuff, even though they're not like a dry cleaner type operation.
S- So Taylor, mainly because it would be ancillary to that whole dry cleaner concept, and more historically than now, really. So unless the tailor is doing some sort of cleaning similar to a dry cleaner on site, the Taylor concept is when we look at fire insurance maps, which is a resource that we use as part of the phase one process. It'll say Taylor on the building, and we've often found that it was a tailor slash cleaner, or they did both on site, or it was a dry cleaner that also did tailoring on site. So those are usually hand in hand. If you go into a tailor nowadays, it's probably not also a dry cleaner, but I've seen some very strange things. So it's possible. It's definitely very possible.
Okay, that's interesting. And then tell us again, what does AAI stand for?
That is all appropriate inquiry. That is the purpose of the phase one is to complete all appropriate inquiry, which means you've done all of your interviews, you've requested all of the records from regulatory agencies, you have looked at all of the things that could possibly give you information on your site and whether or not there's a problem.
This all sounds expensive. I know that you don't work for minimum wage. And so, yeah, maybe you have a slide coming up, but talk about, or going back even to the slide before, you've got the different columns, the ERE to the RSRA to the transaction screen to the phase one to the phase two. Did I get those right?
Yes, perfect.
Oh,
Good job.
that's good because I only looked at the screen this morning. I'm assuming that the further across you go from left to right, the more expensive you're talking. So as a business owner, as an investor, as someone who's getting ready to lease some property, how do you start? I mean, can you go look at websites, or you probably have something coming up here.
I
Um,
do. So this is just a little bit more detail on what each one of those things that we looked at is. So the environmental risk evaluation is more of a screening tool. You can kind of use that as your starting point and then decide if you need to go into one of the other scopes. The risk assessment is generally the starting point for SBA. And the transaction screen, it tells you whether or not there are potential environmental concerns. And again, that would be, say you have, some residential properties, or it's a small like mom and pop shop in a, on a corner with all residential around it. You could do a transaction screen on that as well. It's generally not for your bigger facilities that are higher risk.
okay. And so is a transaction screen where you're basically doing like pulling up a website and seeing what, I know in California we've got a good website that people can go look at that's free.
And there are tools that, I guess anybody can go and use on their own, like that California website. There we have actually two that we can use in California. We go through and do that for all of these just because I think it's good practice to do that, but it's not required to check the websites. It just goes into that whole interview, getting your regulatory information. You can submit a paper copy to any regulatory agency. Most of them now have email or online forms for that. But we do, as part of the transaction screen, you should get some sort of data from a regulatory agency. You can use that as one of your resources. They require 3, and you go through until you think you've determined, I know what happened at the property, and then you can stop. With a phase one, you need to go through those steps regardless. And with a risk assessment, the record search and risk assessment, sorry, that is, you look at the database report and it tells you what is wrong or if there's anything wrong for your property, and then any property within a 1 mile radius. And it's similar with the environmental risk evaluation. You just don't look at historical stuff, whereas with the risk assessment and the transaction screen, you do.
Okay. And so let's go back to cost for just a second,
Sure.
because I'm sure everyone's wondering how much does this all cost? During lunch, you said that you can start with a simple process, and maybe that simple process will satisfy people. What is it? What's kind of like the starting point for fees?
Sure. I'm going to caveat all of this by saying it depends where you are and what the property is. But with the
Yep.
screening tool, those are about $250. That's just something that we developed on our own. There's no standard for that. The risk assessments, it depends, where you are, but I think those can run anywhere from 400 to 550, something like that. And then your transaction screens, again, they probably 900, and then they can go up from there depending on how quickly you want it, where the site's located. And phase ones, I mean, nowadays probably like
Yeah, we're talking
2000.
May of
Yeah,
2023, just so that people know when we're
right.
talking.
Yeah, so I would say, with what is included in a phase one nowadays, 2000 is probably a good like median range. If you've got like a vacant parcel somewhere, might it be less? Sure. If you're looking at a whole, shopping mall, it's obviously going to be more. We've done, an entire movie studios with, down in Southern California with multiple buildings, and it, that take, multiple days, and those are obviously going to be more. But for
Right.
regular folks that aren't doing, $70 million loans, it's
People buying
probably,
a
yeah,
little office building or a corner strip mall or something.
right. You're going to be closer to that $2,000 number.
And so at what point is it that you move from being working in your office and doing a desk evaluation to going in the field?
The transaction screen would be when we go out on site. So anything that's not just a records review, we would go out and actually inspect the property, look at what's in the surrounding area, and walk through the building, get to see all the cool stuff that they do. And that's those are my fun ones. I like seeing all the pictures from those. You get some pretty interesting things, like how they make M&Ms. That was a cool one for me.
Oh, yeah, that would be cool.
Mhm.
Um, so as we're talking about this, it's occurring to me that people are going to prepare a property for sale a lot of times in advance, even before a real estate agent or anyone gets involved, and they may go through and paint the building and maybe put a coating on the floor if it's like a shop or something. So it's got a nice, what are those coatings called? Um,
Like the epoxy.
like an epoxy, exactly, an epoxy coating or something like that. So everything looks really, really nice. As when you're doing environmental assessment, I mean, do you want to see that all prettied up, repaired area, or do you want to go in before they do that and maybe say, oh, hey, before you put down this nice epoxy coating, we're going to have to drill holes in the floor to do some testing, based on the history and the transaction record. Maybe you should do the epoxy coating later.
So me personally, I would obviously like to see it before that process, and I will say that because while a lot of folks think, "Oh, I want it to look great so they don't find any problems," sometimes that's hurtful for them because they I, okay, let me see. There's so many stories. I don't even know where to start.
Tell a
Okay.
story. I love stories.
Well, so we did a site, for example, where they had started a new construction. They'd done their nice epoxy floors. They put in drainage systems. It's a lovely new facility. Unfortunately, it used to be a dry cleaner, and the state wants them to put in vapor mitigation measures. And had they done that before they started construction, it would have cost them pennies. Now they're probably looking at closer to $500,000 or more to
Whoa.
install all of that. So I always say it's better to look at everything in advance than after you make everything all nice and pretty, because you don't want to damage your nice new floors. You don't want it's just so much easier and will cost you so much less money. And sometimes we can write off things that might have looked like a problem. We've definitely done facilities where it said it was a cleaner of some kind, and then we were able to go in before they renovated the building, and we looked at it and we saw that there was no evidence of dry cleaner equipment at all. You can see scarring, you can see where they bolted equipment to the ground, and they claimed that it was just a drop-off facility. And we went into the building and we saw there was no evidence of equipment in there. So that made sense with what they indicated during the interview, and we said, okay, this makes sense. You don't have to go in and do any sort of sampling. And there was obviously a lot of other pieces along with that, but it was really helpful to be able to see what the floor looked like and confirm, okay, you didn't have equipment in here. Now, had they, retiled, which is what they were planning on doing, we wouldn't have been able to see the concrete floor, and we would have probably recommended more work because I don't know what it looked like. So that would have cost them a lot of money.
Right. Okay. So you said $500,000 and pennies. So by pennies, I'm not thinking that you're talking less than a buck 99. I mean, were you talking like maybe 5,000 being pennies compared to 500,000, or
It would
15,000, or
have
what maybe?
it would have been less than 100,000 probably, just because you can put in the venting, you can put in, the piping, everything that has to go into that floor to install a vapor mitigation system. They could have done that without now having to work around their drains, their brand new epoxied floor, all of the equipment that they just put in. It's going to be really difficult to do the stuff that they want to do in that building and still meet their obligations.
Okay, cool. Let's go ahead and see what else you got in here. Oh, non-scope considerations. You got asbestos, lead-based paint, radon, mold, wetlands, flooding, drinking water, emerging contaminants. I don't know what that means.
So emerging contaminants is things that are not yet necessarily regulated, but that are going to be regulated. And EPA actually just started, I think they actually did release new regulations on PFAS specifically. But this would be, and I don't know if you've been following
No,
PFAS in the
no, I have
news.
no idea what
Okay.
PFAS means, and I'm sure that most of the people who watch this video are going to have no idea because if you just substitute an E for an F, it looks like peas.
Okay, fair
And I
enough.
love peas.
Well, you probably don't love PFAS. It's basically any like the Teflon coated pans. They
Oh,
have
okay,
PFAS in
yeah.
them. So that's the best example. Any sort of the carpets that have coating on them to keep stains from getting in them, those have PFAS in them.
So
It's
you
a
it
big
sounds to me like the state of California and the EPA is getting ready to go after homeowners.
no, that's not what the intent is, but it's
Okay,
there, it's in everything. It's in drinking water, it's in everything. It's
yeah.
not simple to get rid of, and that's what they're working on trying to regulate and minimize right now, which is why if you Google PFAS, you will find all sorts of stuff on it. Don't buy aluminum foil if it doesn't say there's no PFAS in it. Just
Okay.
that's a tip for for right now.
All right. So basically, all these things on this list are things that you don't look at this point,
It's those are
right?
things that are not required as part of the ASTM scope for a phase one. They are definitely things that can be added. It expands the scope basically. So generally we include asbestos, lead-based paint, and mold for I would say probably 90% of our lenders. That's just something that they're concerned about. Flood has been coming up more often, so we're doing that depending on the region. Radon, if you do any sort of Freddie Mac, Fannie, any of the HUD properties, they're going to want to know if there's a radon concern for your residential complexes. Wetlands, if you're going to develop a site, it's probably a good idea to know if there's wetlands on your property because you can't really just demo over that and do whatever you want without a lot of legwork.
Hmm.
And drinking water, it's going to depend on what state you're in. For example, New Jersey has the Safe Drinking Water Act where you have to do testing if you have a well on your property. That's a requirement prior to sale. So there's a lot of different pieces of things that I think it's a good idea for people to be educated on, but not everybody wants them included for whatever reason.
Got it. Okay. So, but these are all reports either you can do in-house or you could subcontract out and maybe do the sampling for or something, right?
Sure. We actually all these non-scope considerations we can put into the phase one. So it's stuff that we would talk about. Like for example, with lead-based paint, we would go and we would look in a building. If there's peeling paint everywhere, and we know it was built prior to 1978, then we would say, okay, you're going to need to do a lead-based paint survey before you do any renovations. Same thing with asbestos. With the wetlands, we can look at the different maps that they have and say, okay, like this is a wetlands area. We look at the 100 and 500-year flood zone, and we can give a determination on that. There's resources that we have for all of these. So if somebody wants to know whether they need to do more assessment or investigation for one of these, that's definitely something that can be added into any of the phase ones.
Okay, cool. All right. Red herrings and red flags. What do we got here?
So these are just different things that when we finish a report, it's red flags are okay. If I have one of these on my property, it's probably going to be a problem and then require additional investigation. So if, for example, if there's an active case on your property or next door, it's most likely going to be a recognized environmental condition, and you have to either get more data or make sure you're following all the regulatory requirements. It's stuff that you know before you even start. Okay, this is going to be a problem and it's going to require additional, I guess, investigation or care when you look at it. The red herrings, it's okay, everything looks like it's fine, or it doesn't look like. We'll take the permits, for example. So say it's a gas station and all of their permits are okay right now. Were they always okay? Maybe, maybe not. We've done a ton of gas stations where we go through their prior permits or their prior inspections and we find, they have like leak detection that's not working, or they have alarms that were going off that weren't fixed for months at a time. I've had people tell me, oh, my sensor is bad and it's not really a problem, and we've replaced it 3 times and I don't know why it's still a problem. And it's like, well, does that mean your tank is leaking, sir? Because that might be what it is, and maybe it's not the sensor. So there's a lot of things where like everything is fine right now. It was a gas station, but there's no tanks here right now. There's no lifts right now, and I'm always leery when I hear everything is fine right now, because I don't know if that means everything was fine before. Did they have tanks that they removed in the 70s when we didn't have regulatory compliance and there was, fuel spilling everywhere, but they were like, it's fine. And they just put some more dirt on top of it and everything was fine because they said so. So there's a lot of different things in here. And I think we talked about the green dry cleaners. There's
Right.
a lot of times where they are green now, but they weren't green before, and they
Hmm.
didn't change out their machines. So the machines that were using that PCE, the solvents before, now they might be running something else, but that doesn't mean that that equipment didn't leak. So that's
Hmm.
still a potential problem. You have to look at what did they use before? Was there any sort of paperwork or listings in the database report or anywhere that would give us a hint as to whether or not there was a problem or a
Hmm.
potential problem? And then with the closed cases, that's a little bit more of like a paperwork research kind of thing, and we can go over that when we do the websites a little bit later. But it's basically the site's closed now, and we have to now find out, was it closed when there was some sort of regulatory framework? Was there anything that said, okay, it has to be, you know, clean to a certain standard? Was there sampling? Were the results still compliant to what the requirements are in present day? Like, as an example, here in California, they changed the standard for PCE, what the screening level is. That caused a huge issue in 2019 when they lowered what the screening
The
level was.
threshold. Yeah.
Yeah, so sites that were compliant and about to get closure, all of a sudden were no longer compliant, and that caused a huge issue.
Hmm.
But so those are all things that we have to look at, that it might seem fine on the surface, but maybe it's not. It just requires a little bit more research.
This is like totally fascinating to me. And I was just looking at the time, and it's like time is really flying. So let's just really quickly
Sure.
do one last thing here and then let's close it off. Because
Okay.
I know that every state is different, and some states have got sites where you can do research, very few of them. Other states don't, and there's differences in the ability of what you can do and how friendly it is for consumers or whatever. But since I'm in California, you're happen to be in California right now. Let's just go ahead and talk just for a minute about the online databases, and let's just take a quick peek at California's, and then we'll call it a wrap. Okay.
Sure. So California has 2 different websites that we can use. One is run by the State Water Resources Control Board, and that's GeoTracker, which we can look at. And the other one is the Department of Toxic Substances Control, which is more soil-based. And they also have an online website, but 9 times out of 10, it will link you back to GeoTracker because they don't do as many cases. They have been around longer than the State Water Resources Control Board, but most of their cases will go over to the Water Board unless they happen to grab it and just want to keep it. So we can go and look at, actually, that Bellwin Cleaners site is the one that I have up.
Okay. All right. And then New Jersey and Pennsylvania, they have some websites, but they're Not as
They
thorough or
do.
as easy to use.
The New Jersey site is not very user friendly at all. In fact, the reason we have screen grabs is because it's a hit or miss. Sometimes you might go into the state website and it just won't load at all. And I didn't want that to be an issue today, so I have actual little screenshots so we don't have to watch a blinking cursor as it tries to load.
All right. All right. So GeoTracker.
Yep, you can actually just go into Google and put in GeoTracker and it will take you to basically this page. You can put in either the address or if you know what the name of the facility is, you can put that in. I put in former Bellwin because I knew that was the site that we'd worked on. And you put that in and hit the little search and it will give you a nice map. It's super easy to read, super easy to understand. There is a little key at the bottom
Oh,
and
should we go back to the
nope,
map? Is that what you're saying?
that's
Oh,
totally fine. That's totally
okay.
fine. Once you click on that link, that's very obviously a link. It's easy to understand. It will give you the snapshot of what's going on at the site. From here, you can navigate to any number of places, which would be like an additional map that shows you the aerial photograph. And the neat thing about GeoTracker is you can actually download all of the documents that they have available right from their website. So
So
everything
those
is
blue
literally at your
titles
fingertips.
are all linked, and so we
Yep.
can download Rux's report here, the site
Yes.
assessment report. Okay,
Yep.
cool.
So everything is super easy. And if you're like, hey, I want to know what my neighbor is up to, you can go and see if they have an active or closed case and find out what they did. And you can say, great, I'm safe. Or, hey, I don't like that, they have an active case and it doesn't look like they're in compliance. And then you can go make a big stink about it. But yeah, it's actually a really cool website and it's really easy to use. And I always tell everybody about it if you're concerned. This is a nice way for you to be educated about what's going on in your neighborhood.
And this is for California only.
This
Just
is
want
for
to make that
California.
clear.
Correct.
So if you're not in California, you probably don't have something like this. And
Right.
then what's this slide about?
So this is just an example of the information that you can get when you download any of those reports. There's figures, and this is just a quick little case study of what was at this facility. It used to be a dry cleaner. We went out and we did some soil gas testing, we did some indoor air testing, and then that big blob on the right side is when we contoured out, okay, this is where the contamination is and what the concentrations were. So all of this information is available through those links that we just looked at.
So that's what, a plume study or something like that? Is that what you guys call it?
Yes, yeah. So that was the soil gas study. So this is just the soil gas. This wasn't the indoor air. There wasn't like a really pretty map to go with that since that was just inside the building. But this was soil gas concentrations from the highest concentration going out.
Okay. And the picture down at the bottom, it looks like two compressors of something with a little thing that looks like a bomb in the middle.
Yeah, so that thing that looks like a bomb is actually an air canister. So those sit out for 24 hours. They suck in air, and then they get sent off to the lab, and the lab tells us what the concentrations were.
Oh, okay. Interesting.
Yep. So that's
All right. And then what's going on with the picture up above with the orange cone?
So the picture at the top is where we installed a soil gas vapor probe. So it's just a really small, and everybody always asks me like, how crazy is it? It's not. It's maybe like an inch diameter hole that we just drill down, and then you put a little tube with a probe in. And this we hadn't connected everything to this yet, but it was just being set up to connect the equipment to it. And we
And
take the reading over there. It's another canister, not as big as this one. It's a smaller one that also looks a little bit like a bomb. And then those get sent off to the lab for readings.
how deep are the holes that you bore?
This one, I think, if it tells me on the right, which it doesn't. So I think that one might have been a 5 foot deep one.
Oh,
So we
okay.
did 5 foot outside and then we did sub slab inside the building.
What do you mean by subslab? Oh, just going below the slab.
Yes, just below the slab of the building.
Okay, got it. And what's the deepest borehole that you've done for testing?
Oh gosh. I mean they can get super deep. The most common would be not for the soil gas so much because it's not as valuable for the initial stage, but we could go down, 25 feet to get groundwater or soil samples, and then we'll do intervals for soil. So but you can go down, until you hit groundwater. You can go pretty deep, but they get more expensive the deeper you've got to drill because you need different rigs.
Got it. Okay. And then
So
what's
now
this?
this one's New Jersey. This was mainly just as a comparison to show you how not user friendly it is, because you go to this page and you say, okay, what do I want? And those three different options give you these three different screens, and you might think, sure, I know my location, but that's not what the website thinks. The location's like, oh, you want everything in your city? Sure, no problem. And you have
Mm,
to actually click on advanced to be able to put in an address. And then you put in your address, and it takes it minutes. And then it spits out, okay, here's your site. And then you have to know to use the drop down for a bunch of letters that may not mean anything to you. And then you can finally go and get information on your site, which sometimes isn't very helpful, because if it's not a newer case, it's not going to have that nice phone number and that for somebody that you can call and say, "Hi, what's going on with this site?" You instead get this, which looks like a bunch of jargon, and then you have to file a very long and tedious form and wait about 2 weeks to maybe get a response that says, "Yes, we have records. You can come in and review them in 2 months." And this was an example of some sites that we did where we drilled. That site up top, I think, was actually in California. And then the bigger picture was a site in New Jersey where it was very obvious that they had petroleum contamination. But all of this to say that it's really important to be able to have access to files. There's really no way you're going to know, did they do something? Did they do it right? What does it look like in comparison to today's standards? Is it still protective of human health and the environment? So files are super, super important for what we do, and it's nice to have that data to be able to give an accurate assessment of what's going on.
very cool. Hey, Rex, today was really, really interesting. Um,
Yay.
I'm actually shocked how much time we spent on this. I wasn't thinking that we would go this long. A lot of great stories, a lot of great information, and we're going to put your information down in the description of the video. So if anyone has any questions, they could reach out to you. So
Great.
thank you so much for joining us today and for lending us your expertise.
Thank you for having me. It was fun.
My pleasure. So this has been Chris Vogt, your professional connector, commercial real estate advisor, and business broker, talking to you today about environmental concerns with real estate, whether it's real estate that you own, you're leasing, or you have a business you want to sell, because that can be important too. Thank you very much, everyone. We'll see you on our next video.